the messages of the things they're using skills
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to see you all and to welcome you to this very special evening. Those of you who were here last year to hear our talk on the philosophy of spiritualism will know what an interesting evening it was. And I'm so pleased that he's offered to come back. And note I say offered to come back to us to talk this evening on reincarnation, the law of karma and spiritualism. I know it's going to be a super evening, so we thank you very much for coming out.
My pleasure.
And after our talk, I know he'll be pleased to respond to any questions you might have. So the evening is in your hands now. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you once again. Thank you so much for having me. We're going to talk about a hot subject tonight, so if you don't mind, I'm going to take my jacket off. We get warmed up and get ready to go to work. After the talk, the subject we're going to talk about, I would invite any questions that you might have, particularly on the subject or on any other subject as it relates to spiritualism. We have, Bev and I, my wife, spend quite a bit of time in Lilydale, New York, which is the North American Center for Spiritualism. And I have the distinct privilege of chairing what they call the Thought Exchange in Lilydale, which is a vehicle for exchanging ideas on spiritualism. And it's held twice a week, Wednesday night, Saturday night during the season, which is July and August. And we invite people to put questions on a piece of paper, and they put them on the table, and then we read them all, and we invite an exchange of ideas, and sometimes it gets quite heated, sometimes it gets very interesting, because as spiritualists we all have our own view of things. So hopefully it'll be a productive evening, and then I'll contribute something to your understanding of what we're going to talk about. And I'd like to start this talk by reading a short statement on the philosophy of spiritualism. I think because it basically sums up what we're really all about, and it's a good starting point for tonight. Spiritualism as a philosophy, I stress, as a philosophy, is a knowledge-based process of evolution in which every form in the universe is evolving from a lower to a higher form of existence. And this process was initiated by an intelligent force, which we know to be divine, and is the end result of a grand design in which the original condition of all things were matter and motion. That's spiritualism's philosophy. The original condition of all things were matter and motion. And these two conditions eventually evolved into what we now know as our universe, that which we exist in. And within this universe, our solar system, in the gaseous form of our Earth, which in turn eventually evolved into a mineral form, which further evolved into a vegetable form, then into an animal form. And at some point in time in this process, the human form evolved, and within it, an internal intelligence, our spirit. Some of us call it the soul. And as spiritualists, we know, we don't believe, we know that after the death of this material form, the spirit continues this evolutionary process in an eternal search for knowledge, which it turns into wisdom, which is ultimately defined in love, moving full circle back to the divine source of its creator. We also know that communication is possible between the spirits of those in the human form and those spirits who have evolved beyond the physical. And through this communication, And I think this is very important. Through this communication, we have the opportunity to gain knowledge. A level of knowledge which can make our individual lives here on this earth plane more useful, more meaningful. That's the purpose of it all. That's the purpose of communication. To recognize that we have this opportunity to gain this level of knowledge. Makes our lives here more useful, more meaningful. And in the process, it converts to the harmony of the whole of mankind. And that's the essence of spiritualism as a philosophy. We all have emotional attachments to it, but as a philosophy, that's the essence of it. Now I'm going to make another statement, if I might. Spiritualism, as it's practiced, is somewhat different. It could be argued that as it is practiced, it's an illogical, emotional grasping at spirituality and communication with spirit in a search for self-gratification. Now, if that sounds extreme, it was meant to be. Spiritualism is populated by extremes, and I'm going to leave you dangling on that one because it opens up a philosophical debate that has divided spiritualists since our very beginnings, but food for thought. But it's also a very good opening to put on the table the subject of tonight's discussion, and that's reincarnation, the law of karma, and how they relate to spiritualism. We know that spiritualists are divided right down the middle on this subject. Right down the middle. There's no equivocation. You either believe in it or you don't believe in it. To some it's a natural occurrence, others obviously not. The official stance, however, taken by the major governing bodies within our religion, those that organize our church functions, set the guidelines, such as the SNU here in the UK, we call it the Spiritualist Church of Canada, in our country, and the NSAC, National Spiritualist Association of Churches in America. Show me the proof. That's what they say. Not proven, therefore not officially endorsed. But they do, however, if you look at them really closely, they do leave the door open very slightly for the individual to decide. And I suppose you could say that's just another instance of spiritualism sitting on the fences. You know, risking the offense of individual opinions. But I think we do have to take the risk, my friends, at some point in time of offending individual beliefs to have some continuity within our structures, within spiritualism. I guess if we don't do that, we run the risk of having no common foundation for those practices that sometimes we're so divided on. But we have to have a common denominator somewhere along the line. But before we go any further, I think to get into any meaningful discussion on this subject, which I think is very, very important, because it's so integral to, what we really are. We need to develop an understanding of it. Say, what does it really mean? Think about it. What does reincarnation really mean? Essentially, it means the repeated incarnation of the soul into the flesh, pure and simple. Whatever your understanding of it. The common dictionary definition is the rebirth of the soul into another body. Sometimes we also hear the term metempsychosis used, which essentially means the passage of the soul as an immortal essence at the death of the material body into another living body. And you also, in certain circles, hear the term transmigration of souls. It's the passing from one body into another. In early civilizations, they carried it one step further because it could also mean transmigration of one soul into a lower form, that of an animal. It's a punishment for your sins. But it's generally accepted, I think, amongst spiritualists and other believers in the concept, and non-believers, that it's a human sort of thing. When you have a close look at it, however, I think you'll find that there are many, many degrees of doctrine on reincarnation. I use that term doctrine deliberately because reincarnation is commonly tied in with religion. It's a common essence. Religion deals in doctrine, so you can tie the two together. But beyond these various schools of thought, various doctrines, there's one basic and fundamental principle that underlies all schools of thought on the subject, and that is this. There is a man, an immaterial something called the soul, the spirit, inner self, whatever term you want to use, which does not perish at the death of the body, but which survives as an entity, and after a period of rest is reborn or reincarnates into a new body, a new birth, in which it proceeds to live a new life in that body. It is essentially unconscious of its past experiences, but contains the essences of them. And these essences, or the past experiences, if you would, have a bearing on the makeup, the character, and the personality of that new individual. It's also accepted that this new birth is governed by a law of attraction, which operates under what you might call a strict code of justice, which tracks that reincarnating soul to conditions which relate back to its previous life. It's not a law that's not unknown to us, the law of attraction. It's natural law within spiritualism. It's universal. It's universal and it applies to all things, not just the soul. So there's a slight difference there when we go one step beyond the spiritualist. And I think when most of us consider this subject, we commonly understand it in terms of Western society, Western philosophy. But I think it's very important to understand that this can be a very limited view because there are many, many differences between what we think in the West and what other philosophies throughout history in the world consider. And I think there's also 2 points to consider in this debate as it relates to spiritualism. The first is the assumption by most spiritualists who support the concept of reincarnation that is the phenomena of living different lives only on this earth plane. And the debate is usually supported by the justification of past lives revelations, is what we witness in some practices. We call it past life regression. The second, I think, and much more important point is the question of the origins of spirit. In other words, where did it come from? Where did spirit actually come from? I think that's the question that has to be answered before any discussion on this subject can begin. And I think without this answer, the concept of reincarnation, it could be said that the whole subject of spiritualism has no substantive meaning beyond mere belief. And if we were relegated to beliefs, it could be said that we're no different than any other religion because religion commonly deals in belief, which are perceived by those involved with that particular religion to be the truth. But I think it has to be said that the truth, a truth that is based substantially or solely on beliefs has no substantive underpinnings, no substantial support for its recognition. So, recognizing there are 2 diametrically opposing views within spiritualism, let's agree to disagree. And use them as a basis, however, for moving on to an historical look at this eternal date and take ourselves back to the beginning of civilization, back to the dawn of the beginning of man, where you'll actually find its origins. They actually say it started in Egypt with the ancient eastern tribes. And then it progressed to the Chaldean civilization, through the Druids, and it even said it extended over into China. Some even attributed its beginnings back to the lost city of Atlantis. It's even said that early African explorers found traces of what they thought was a strange belief in the future return of a soul to some other form of new body on the earth. So it seems if you take a look at this broad range, geographical range at that time. It had some sort of universal acceptance. But what's interesting to note is you can't trace it back to any specific point in time. Most things you can. You can trace spiritualism, modern spiritualism, back to a specific point in time. You can trace most things back to a specific point in time. But this one interesting concept has no beginning, in a sense of, recorded history. It seems to have been an almost intuitive part of the psyche of the individual. Ever since they developed some form of intelligent conceptualization of the world. It also seems there has always been some form of belief that spiritual component actually survives through this concept. And then originally it was commonly centered around a ghost idea. That somehow a ghost came back to live in a new body. It was a very mystical thing. And then it further evolved to the fact that this ghost was immortal. And then it must have lived before the last birth. It must have had a whole series of births behind it, a whole chain of births. And then it further evolved to a reasoning that the next life is dependent upon something done or left undone in the life it just lived. And that idea seems to have been pretty universal in scope. And they also seem to believe a universal acceptance that the soul was not a single entity, that it was a complex concept or being, or whatever you want to call it. It was complex and multifaceted. And from these early times, it evolved to the point where recorded history actually started coming into play and giving us an idea of how it evolved. Before that, it was strictly conceptual, but after that, there was some record of it. As I said, it actually is felt in some quarters that it started in Egypt, where we get the first recorded glimpse of the diversity of beliefs in this subject. There are diversities. In this very early society, they believed that man had several bodies within his being. And they even categorized them into distinct and separate parts. They called them sheaths. And I'm going to mention this isn't a test, so you don't have to remember it. There was the Ka. They called it the divine spirit in man. The Ab, which was the intellect of man, or his individual will. Hati, which was the vitality of man. Tet, which was the astral body. Sahu, which was the etheric double. And Cha, which was the physical body. And all of these, except the physical, were destined for some form of new birth. All of them. And it was based upon a cycle that they believed took a period of 3,000 years. Any of you know of the ancient Chaldeans, where that actually exists? That land of Chaldea? There's great turmoil going on in that part of the world right now. It's between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. They call it Iraq. It was a stretch of about 400 miles long by about 100 miles wide. And there they also taught that the soul was a complex being, but only certain parts of it perished, while other parts survived to pass on through a series of not only earth, but otherworld existences, until it achieved a level of purity and found a permanent place in that land of eternal light and infinite bliss, as they called it. And they also believed that before entering into this state of bliss, the soul was able to revisit all its previous incarnations and come to understand the connection and the reasoning behind its past experiences, and use that wisdom to benefit future races as they came upon the earth. As I said earlier, we also filtered over to China, where they believe that the human soul is also composed of several different parts. But beyond that, school of thought vary quite considerably. Some believe that the soul was comprised of two parts, the Wan, which is a spiritual principle, and the Phi, which is a semi-material or vital principle. And others believe it was composed of three parts. The Q, which had its seat in the belly, and which hung around after the death of the physical, but eventually it disintegrated at some point in time. And then there's what they call the Wan, which had its seat in the brain and survived to be passed on to future generations, that intellect. Then we move on to the Druids. And we most commonly associate the Druids with Stonehenge, right? In England, that mysterious people that moved those rocks for hundreds of miles and nobody knew how. But they actually came from Western Europe. That's where they originally were centered, in the land of Gaul, commonly known as Spain, France, and that area there. And they came around 400 BC, I think that was the time frame. Some say they actually had their origins back into Egypt and Greece, so you can see the connection between that and their reincarnationist thought. They believed that man had an inner spiritual part, which they called the Awen, which had been through various forms of life, through mineral, vegetable, and animal, before incarnating as a man. It was a progressive thing for them. They called the lower form the Anufu, which ultimately progressed to a higher state, and beyond that to various other states of ecstasy and bliss, all through this process. What I really like about them, though, they were so advanced in their philosophy that when a criminal was sentenced to death, they gave him a reprieve of 5 years. That's so he could go under some formal instruction and meditation, because they didn't want any contaminated souls infiltrating the world of the afterlife. Then we look at the Romans, and we all look at the Romans as pretty intelligent people, but quite contrary to their reputation, they weren't that sophisticated in things metaphysical. I think it's because of their historical stature we tend to assume that they had an expertise or gave great thought to all things. But in reality, there was very little original thought along religious ideas or, spiritual things. They were more mechanical, I think, in their thought, if you take a look at their history. They looked at immortality only as a not proven possibility that was based upon an emotional component of the individual psyche. One of their more famous philosophers, a fellow by the name of Lucretius, actually went on to declare that the fear of eternal life should be banished from the universe. It disturbs the peace of mankind, for it prevents the enjoyment of any security or pleasure. And I guess, except for a few thinkers, the majority of the people in Rome gave very little thought to reincarnation, but they did have a very strange belief in ancestor worship, but it was more in a collective sense. They worshipped their ancestors collectively, and they actually went to great pains to deify them, build monuments to them, and to make sacrifices to them. They were great warriors, they were great businessmen, great administrators. They civilized Europe, but it was all in pursuit of the material. Beyond that, they added very little to the subject we're talking about today, but they had to be mentioned anyway. The Greeks, however, were a different matter. They were history's great philosophers, and as a consequence, they gave a great deal of thought to this subject, and they had such a great range of ideas regarding the actual constitution of the soul, and that's of great importance to as a spiritualist, that constitution of the soul. And this doctrine of reincarnation played a very large part in their religious life. The most popularly accepted belief is that worthy souls pass directly to this state of bliss, without any form of rebirth necessary, not required. But those less worthy went through a period of great punishment, where the memories of their past lives were cleansed And then they moved on to a new rebirth. There's an old hymn that they use. They call them Orphic hymns, which sums it up pretty well. I like this one. It says, "The wise love light and not darkness. When you travel the journey of life, remember always the end of the journey. When the soul returns to the light after their sojourn on earth, they wear upon their more subtle bodies, like searing, hideous scars, the marks of their earthly sins. And these must be obliterated, and they go back to the earth cleansed. But the pure and virtuous and strong proceed directly to the son of Damascus." One of their great teachers is a fellow we know by the name of Pythagoras, who taught that the doctrine of reincarnation accounted for all the inequalities of our life here on earth. He also taught that while the material law was subject to the laws of destiny and death, there was a higher state of being where the soul would rise above the laws of our material world. And this new world had its own set of laws which would ultimately work out the imperfect laws of the material world, establishing harmony, justice, equality, and making up for all the imperfections of earth life. Somewhat comforting. Plato, on the other hand, had a more traditional philosophy. Now, we all know he was considered, I think, the master teacher of things relating to the inner soul. He taught that man had a duality, and this is very important, possessing a material body, which was subject to constant change, death, and disintegration, but also had an immaterial body, which was unchangeable, indestructible, and was a reflection of the divine. And that sounds very strange to me, like spiritualism. He said at the time of death, the soul was severed from the physical and rose purified to higher regions, where it had to give an account of itself and had its future allotted to it. A bit of predestination as well. If it was found to be enlightened enough, it was admitted directly to that state of bliss and union with the infinite being. Those less enlightened and less deserving were sent to a state of purgatory, judgmental, to be purged of their imperfections and returned to earth to work out their own salvation. He also taught, going back again, that the soul was a complex entity which in simplistic terms existed in various areas of the body, physical body. This is important because it reveals a continuing evidence of differences of opinion as to what constitutes the soul. And this is a direct reflection, I would submit, that is, of the many varied concepts of reincarnation, a wide variety of doctrines and philosophies. And this school of thought, through Plato, eventually carried over to what we know as the Middle East, into two very important civilizations to our religious structure in the Western world. That's the Jews and the Essenians, both the forerunners of the Christian religion. Within the earliest Jewish society, it seems to be any doctrines were a special preserved of the priests and a very select few. The Kabbalah is the book of Jewish mysteries, and it taught that when the soul left the body, it did so with no recollection of its past life, and went through a long, boring process of purification, and any effects of its previous lives were worn off over a period of time through a series of transmigrations or reincarnation interspersed by very long periods of rest. It was a process, you might say, of osmosis, as opposed to the Greek view of direct accountability and punishment. The Essenian view was different again by stating that the soul was pre-existent and entrapped in the body, much like it would be in a prison. Now, we all know that the Christian church opposes reincarnation. But in the very early Christian church, there was said to be a secret doctrine that taught the pre-existence of the soul which had some form of birth. You can go back to their very early writings. Even one opinion said that John the Baptist was a reincarnation of Elias. Another sect of the church were known as the Gnostics. It was a mystical order which taught reincarnation openly and plainly. So differences in doctrine were commonplace in those days and very disruptive within that early Christian church. So much so that it was declared a heresy by the hierarchy of the church, and a law was passed condemning it. The Christian church today still opposes it, as does Islam. Now, for the most part, you'll notice that our discussion to this point has been centered geographically in the West and the Middle East. But where it really gets interesting is when you move to India, the cradle of reincarnation. You'll notice in the things we've been talking about so far, there's been one common theme. It's notable for its limitations in time, and it went through various phases of popularity in all these civilizations. But in India, and particularly within the Hindu religion, it's a doctrine that's always been. It's been taught from the very early ages of that civilization right up to the present time. It's a way of life with them. As one source of reference that I looked at put it, says, to quote passages relating to incarnation from the Hindu books would be akin to compiling a library of many volumes. Their sacred writings are filled with so many references to reincarnation that if they were eliminated, it would be like the play of Hamlet without Hamlet. What I really had found interesting is that I had to change my opinion of the solidarity of thought on this subject. Now, my early research on this pointed out many variations of thought on reincarnation within the West. And I assumed that that probably was so because of the geographical and societal influences and differences. But within the Hindu religion, I was astounded to find so many differences of opinion on the doctrine of reincarnation. It was amazing. There are at least 6 different interpretations within this religion, and they're further complicated by geographical splits. You will find that there's a Brahmist view, the original concept of Hinduism, the original Christ figure for the Hindus. Then there's the philosophy of Kannada. That got my attention. I thought it was Canada. I thought, woo. There's some schools of Kapila and Patanjali. Patanjali we commonly associate with yoga, more commonly termed. And then there's a modern system, which is still practiced widely today, the Vedanta system. And then you move on to the Gautam philosophy, which is Buddhism, because Buddhism was an offshoot of Brahmanism. Buddhism originated with the Hindu religion, or with the Hindu civilization. But even here within Buddhism, there are geographical fault lines. There is major differences in thought between the north of India and the south of India. It's dramatic, diametrically opposing views. But there are some common themes as well. That is this, one being that life on earth was a period of hardship and sorrow. That was a common theme. It was a period of hardship and sorrow. And the only hope was the opportunity to get out of it. Get out of this life that we lived in. And the expectation of evolving from the physical to the spiritual being. Now we all have that expectation of that true existence of spirit. But what a world it would be if we were living a period of sorrow and, chagrin and maligning ourselves for having to live here, just, in the expectation of moving somewhere else. The material life was considered a period of ignorance even. A period of ignorance in the life of the soul. Well, that's true. Because the soul does enter this world in a state of ignorance, but a state of ignorance that's pure and innocent, searching for knowledge. Not in the context that they're talking about, a period of ignorance. It was simply an illusion from which the soul was continually trying to liberate itself from that bondage of materiality in that ignorance. But they also agreed that man was a complex being with those many sheaths ranging from the lower forms to the more spiritual, and that these various bodies were discarded as the soul advanced on its way to perfection. Common theme. And it was commonly accepted that these sheaths were divided into categories, 7 categories to be precise: material body, the vital body, the astral body, or you might call it the etheric double, more relative to spiritualist thinking, the animal soul, the human soul, the spiritual soul, and finally the divine spirit. The overriding philosophy centered on the belief that there was one infinite energy from which all evolved and to which all returned. And I think it's also important to understand that within the Hindu philosophy, that the question of the life and the soul, present and future, was secondary to the question of the relationship of the human soul to the infinite being. It wasn't the how that was important, it was the why. And that brings us back to Western society, where reincarnation is a compilation of everything we've talked about so far. Everything. It's also important to understand that even in the face of this strong Christian resistance, it's always had support in the West, but it's only really in the past 100 years that it's gained any form of notoriety or controversy or acceptance. Still in its infancy in our society, and perhaps that's why it embraces such a wide range of philosophies and beliefs that we so commonly run into. Hindu influence is very popular, particularly that yogi concept that we talked about, particularly in California. And there are also strong support for Madame Blavatsky's theosophical teachings, if you look at it. There are those in the West who lean towards the Grecian and the Egyptian thought. And of course there are those within our own community of spiritualists and spiritualism who support that concept. Some common themes within those various Eastern schools of thought is a timeline associated with the rebirth. That this rebirth takes place within a specific time cycle between 1500 and 2000 years. And that the rebirth was directly associated with the law of karmic attraction. There's also another common theme, and that I think has its roots in the materialistic nature of our society, and that goes back to the question of the how and the why. I think it could be safely said that those in our Western philosophy are more concerned about the how than the why, and I think that's probably directly related to our materialistic view of our society, more concerned with the how than the why. Could be said just as much like spiritualists, more concerned with mediumship than philosophy. The various timeline theories are really interesting. You've got to ask yourself, is the question 1,500 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, or does the soul reincarnate immediately after death? Some you talk to believes that the soul reincarnates shortly after death, with a very short period of time to adjust itself into a new balance of character and preparing for the new birth. Others hold that there's a period of waiting where the soul digests the experiences of its past life, mulling over its mistakes, and making plans to rectify those mistakes. Little pre-planning, strategic planning for the next life. The lower the spiritual development of the soul, it seems, throughout this, is the longer the period of rest. Another interesting question I think we have to ask ourselves, where does the soul go during these rest periods? Where does it reside? Again, if you take a look at the various philosophies, it depends upon the level of spirituality, and that there may be many different planes of existence. Lower, attracting lower, higher, attracting higher. In our own society, we have that concept of past life regression, which indicates that the rest period can be very, very short. If you look at the cases that have been stated, it may in fact be even intergenerational, no rest period at all. All very interesting. But I'd like to stray a bit now, and I want to touch basically on that subject I talked about just a minute ago, the law of karma. Because there's a great deal misunderstood about the law of karma. It's a term generally used by Hindu and Western societies, not the other ones. And there are many opinions as to its meaning. But I think it's important to understand that historically, it's a twin doctrine with the concept of reincarnation. It goes hand in hand with reincarnation. Essentially, it's the law of cause and effect as it applies to the law of the soul. It's the law whereby the soul reaps the rewards of whatever it sows, or the lack of rewards for whatever it sows. Accountability. It could suffer from its own actions. There's also a school of thought that gives it a broader meaning, which equates it to a law of reward and punishment, retributive justice, so to speak. A grand law of justice which operates along the lines of personal experiences, character, and the personal life. But I think it's really important to understand karma is not something that people possess. There's no good or bad karma. It's a law that applies to the soul. It's a law of cause and effect as it applies to the soul. In spiritualism, we also have a law of cause and effect. We call it natural law. It applies not only to the soul, though, it applies to all things in existence. It's not selective. It applies to all things. But we do have something very similar that does apply to the soul. We call it the principle of compensation and retribution. Now, I would like to return to the question that's central to any debate in reincarnation. And that is that question of from where did the soul come? Where did it originate from? And I think from a practical point of view, we have to have the answer to this question before there can be any resolution to the question of reincarnation. Indeed, I think it is central to the whole subject of spiritualism itself. It's easy enough to say that it came from God, but that's a generality. And in my opinion, doesn't satisfy the answer to that question to the degree that would satisfy the mechanics of reincarnation, or even our own principle of eternal progress. If we can get the answer to that, then we have the answer to why we wouldn't even be talking about this. It's the most important question. Spiritualism's philosophy, however, does give us somewhat of an explanation on where did the soul come from, in general terms, by this statement. There was a point in the development of the human race when the spirit force became centered in the brain of the unborn infant savage. And that child was born on the human side, whereas his parents remained savages. That is the defining moment in the development of the human form as an intelligent, thinking, reasoning force. Had a duality of makeup, a material component, a spiritual component, as we've seen in some of the earlier philosophies in reincarnation. But it doesn't go beyond that, strangely enough. Even with our own philosophical mentor, Andrew Jackson Davis, who's most important in the development of our philosophical outlook. But at one defining point in his revelations, he calls it a prior organization that assumes a coating when it presents itself to the outer world. A prior organization. That one statement alone raises the whole subject of reincarnation, in fact, the whole subject of spiritualism, to an entirely new level. An entirely new level. But he also states that the birth of the soul is the one and only all-sufficient incarnation of the divine mind. The one and only all-sufficient incarnation of the divine mind. And he also goes further to state that the spirit world is born from the earth and depends upon the earth for its existence. As Hercule Poirot would say, those are three statements that would test our little gray cells to the limit. Should we assume that the life of the spirit originates with the life form on earth as an original creation of that divine intelligence we call God? Is it the result of some form of reincarnation on this earth plane? Or does it originate from some other spiritual universe? I also have another question, if I might. If the purpose of reincarnation in its traditional sense is a life of constant turmoil, and if the soul, in the context of our own philosophy, is a direct incarnation of the divine mind, why would this divine mind condemn its own reflection to a constant life of turmoil and trouble and suffering? Support. In spiritualism, there's great support for reincarnation. As I said, we're divided down the middle. Ewart Carrington, one of our early 20th century pioneers, wrote that, and I'll quote him here, "In many minds, the argument for reincarnation is a strong one, in that life must necessarily be eternal and immortal, inasmuch as it is indestructible by death and continues to exist to all eternity in the future. And for the same reason, it must have also existed from eternity in the past. And it is inconceivable that such a thing as an individual human spirit should continue to exist forever after the moment of birth, while it did not exist at all previous to that event." And he was one of the more prominent spiritualists of his day. It's also been argued that such luminaries as Silver Birch have returned with the message of reincarnation. Now, I'm not an expert on Silver Birch, but from what I've read, his references are not to lives lived on this earth, but they're to lives lived on different astral planes. But even if his message was in the form of traditional thinking, it would be understandable, for it is well known that he was sent to Hannen Swafer's circle as a representative of Native American culture. He wasn't a single, and he was a representative in the form of a Native American Indian. And they believed in reincarnation in one form or another, usually a form associated with a form in a spirit of a natural substance, spirit of the wind, spirit of the water, spirit of the trees. Other spirits have returned with similar messages supporting it, and I think that's important to recognize. And that's natural as well. For when the spirit evolves from the material to the spiritual universe, it takes with it all its psychological imperfections, all its knowledge, all its prejudice. Many spirit forms have come back with the message of Jesus, the Christ Savior. That's documented in spiritualist books. G. Vale Owen's series of books, Beyond the Veil. His mother came back with all her Christian values. You read particularly his first 2 volumes. It's a Christian reference, but it's related to communication with spirit. She came back with her values. In William T. Stead's work, I don't know if you've heard of William T. Stead, he died on the Titanic. He was the editor of the National, it was much similar to our Atlantic Monthly, the Review of Reviews it was called. Very prominent British literist. He developed a working relationship, a communication relationship through the phenomena of automatic writing with a young lady called Julia. It lasted for 6 years. Julia came back with all her Christian values, always referring to the love of Jesus, always referring to, Christian philosophy. They're simply individuals who have passed to the other side with all those opinions. Just the same as when we pass, we will retain all our opinions. And then as you go through the levels of knowledge, that will change. The important thing is, remember, whatever message they bring back should be judged by our own reasoning powers. Does it make sense to us? If it does, fine. Carry it forward with you. If it doesn't, so much so. Silver Birch's concept of different astral planes, I think, is very interesting in this debate, because I recently ran across something that did not support reincarnation in its traditional sense, but at the same time was consistent with this very special spirit that came through. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name of Alfred Kitson. He was a late 1800s, early 1900s, very prominent British spiritualist. He was the founder of the British Lyceum movement. I had the very distinct generational association that my grandfather was a colleague of his, and he set up, in conjunction with Mr. Kitson, the Bolton District Lyceum Council. So there was a connection there. He had a spirit guide. Her name was Zela. She was an ancient Egyptian princess, so they say. And during one sitting, he put the question of reincarnation directly to her. And this was her reply. Our people erred in teaching what you call reincarnation, or being rebirth on earth in the human form, and also in teaching the transmigration of the human soul into the body of a bird or an animal. That was her succinct reply. But the question was then put to her as to where the teachings of spiritualism erred. And she replied with this: you also erred in teaching that your earth life is the only conscious existence that you have ever had, whereas you have had several, all of which have been in preparation for this one, which is the final embodiment that you will be called upon to make. While you have never lived on this earth plane before in your previous life, there are other worlds in space besides your earth, as each successive life is an improvement on the one that preceded it. It follows, and as each is a successful life, as this successive life is an improvement on the one that preceded it, follows that your previous embodiments were on lower planes than your present one. Your earthly body is the highest and best body you have been able to organize, and is the basis or mold of the spirit body to fit it for a life of eternal progress. But no soul can go forward without an organized spirit body such as the earth supplies. And remember that your earth is not the only world in the universe that serves this purpose. There are other solar systems which have among their members earths or worlds similar to yours and serve a similar purpose in God's great plan of being. What did Davis say? Prior organization. Great positive mind is the cause, the universe being the effect, and our spirit is that ultimate design in the scheme of things. You know, it could be that we're looking at reincarnation from a perspective that is too limiting and too emotional, I think. We know that spiritualism officially disputes the traditional philosophy of reincarnation because of the principle of eternal progression of the spirit to a new, higher form in a spiritual universe, with the spirit retaining all its intellectual faculties and memories, not in its reincarnation to a new body in this physical universe without those faculties and memories, nor subjected to a retributive form of justice rather than a universal law of justice based upon love. Logic, however, dictates that perhaps, and I stress perhaps, there may be some merit in that concept of different spiritual universes. And the more I progress in my own understanding of spiritualism, I'm coming very close to that one. Emotion, however, I would suggest, on the other hand, can be both limiting and at the same time overly expansive. Many spiritualists are good examples of this. One who I know believes in reincarnation, and that prior to rebirth, the child chose its own parents. Another says it's the parents who attract the new birth through the law of attraction, but nothing beyond that. Another colleague of mine in Lilydale supports the concept of spirit as being an entirely new creation within each new human form on this earth plane, simply because there's something beautiful about a new spirit being created with the creation of a new physical body. It's also very simple to her. An argument could be made that spiritualism itself is a form of reincarnation. And I would suggest that we look at it from that point of view through the law of eternal progression. Our spirit is, in fact, on a path of rebirths. Rebirths of knowledge, rebirths of wisdom that elevate the spirit from one world in the spiritual universe to another. The spirit enters its life on this earth plane, then is reborn into a higher life, and then to a higher life after that, again and again through those various spheres, until it returns to the divine center of its creation. Certainly not your traditional view of reincarnation, but a form of rebirth nonetheless. It's got to be taken into the equation. There's one thing we can agree upon, though, through all of this, as spiritualists: the debate is not clean and simple within our religion, nor within our practices. So where do you go from there? Where do we move on to? Well, I think from spiritualism's point of view, we must return to the core of that debate, and that is the question of evidential support. Throughout history, if you really take a close look at it, none of the religious philosophies or doctrines has provided any credible or clinical evidence to support its validity. It's an emotional concept based upon a wide range of different beliefs that beyond these beliefs has very little supporting evidence. Personally, I neither support it nor I dispute it. It is absolutely of no consequence to me because it's something over which I have absolutely no control. And if I don't have control over something, I don't worry about it. I speak tonight only in the cause of spiritualism. Spiritualism, and I stress that. If you believe in the concept of reincarnation, you must accept that it is only your understanding of things spiritual. Quite valid, your understanding of things spiritual, but I would suggest is not a complete understanding of spiritualism. Spiritualism is based upon the logical process of knowledge through the faculty of reason. It may be found that spiritualism in the ultimate end of the game is on the wrong side of the argument or the debate. But that too is of no consequence whatsoever. Agree or disagree, spiritualism as it exists does not support the concept of reincarnation. It is not part of our philosophy. And within this context, and I stress, within this context, it cannot be altered to suit an individual purpose. Just as evidence has been produced to prove the existence of spirit and the continuity of life, so I would suggest that the same degree of evidence must be provided for reincarnation. Now, arguments have been made that this proof exists, that it lies in the evidence of past life regression. But within the context, again, I would stress that within the context of our philosophy, as it is with any form of inquiry, the past life theory is just that, a theory. A theory with many variables, too many variables. It does not pass the test of logic. So when we talk about this subject, I think we must separate it from spiritualism. Not that it's valid or invalid, but we must separate it from spiritualism. Spiritualism is one philosophy based upon the pursuit of knowledge, and through our own powers of reasoning determine that which we should accept or not accept. as the truth, a purely logical approach. Reincarnation, however, is simply an emotional belief with many, many different philosophies, documented. No more, no less. And whether we agree or disagree, my friends, we're all going to have to wait to find out. In the meantime, I would suggest that as spiritualists, we must support our spiritualism as it exists, or qualify it to something else. That's the only logical way to look at it. Thank you. Do you want to take a 2-minute break?
Someone do that?
Yes, ma'am.
As we have so many communication with spirits that have already gone past, and they come forward to tell us things, how comes there's not one defined spirit that will actually tell us the full truth?
I don't know if anybody's ever talked to God.
Right.
I don't mean to be facetious on that. We have had many, the beauty of spiritualism, we have so many different opinions. Within our own discussions, we have had so many different opinions come back from the world of spirit. There have been some common denominators, but the essence of spiritualism, to my mind, is take from it what is true to you. Modern spiritualism evolved from a society of free thinkers in America. Now, spiritualism is an American religion, distinct American religion that was born of a religious revolution that could have only happened in the United States, the land of the original revolutionaries. I would suggest that spiritualism, as we know it today, would not exist if that mentality hadn't been in the United States. And it was through that society of free thinkers who questioned everything, put it to the test. They all had different opinions. I mean, as I said, within the thought exchange and we have tremendous heated debates. And I remember as a youngster going there, and we're civilized compared to the old time spiritualists. Sometimes the sheriff had to be called out. It's just the nature. It evolved from a society of free thought through to and through communication, it evolved into a religion. But it was a social activist movement in its early days, and then evolved into a religion after that, based upon a philosophy that had been presented by Andrew Jackson Davis. And the two married and developed into that religious context. But the beauty of it is, I used to be quite dogmatic, pardon the pun, as a spiritualist earlier on. I said, this is spiritualism, my way or the highway. Well, that was Swedenborgianism. It was my way or the highway. When spiritualist philosophy came in, take what from you can. Use your own reasoning powers to process that knowledge which is available to you. Make up your own mind. Nothing is infallible. It's your own mental progress, your own intellectual progress that counts. And we're all on a journey of discovery. We're all searching for that ultimate enlightenment of spiritual, that spiritual euphoria. And I know we all can't. That's why we're here. We can't wait for that day, for that realization. But we have to do it individually, each on our own pathway. And that's where spiritualism is really different, because we don't have to follow anything structured. We can disagree and be accepted. There's a Baptist minister in Ohio back in 1878. I like this. I don't remember dates easily, but I remember this one because I like what he said. He said, spiritualism plays the part of the religious clown. It accepts all the odds and ends of every creed. It accepts all the creepy crawlies from all society. And he was right. But he was being derogatory in his context. But if you take a look at what he said, he was right. It was Noah's Ark in spiritualism, encompassing everybody. What a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful religion, that it takes in everybody. So the next time we see somebody that walks in off the street that doesn't smell quite as nice as we do, or making funny noises, he's another human being on a journey at his own pace. And what a wonderful thing. What a wonderful thing. Does that help with your question? Yeah.
I'm a bit confused.
Join me.
I've never listened to you. I've been all around the world and back again, but I'm a bit confused. You said that spiritualism is a philosophy, but you've just said it's a religion. And religion was built on doctrines, the Buddhism and all the other religions. So is spiritualism philosophy born out of the revolution of thought in America, and that's something that we've all bought into, free thinking and the rest of it? Or is it religion, which you just said it was?
Very good question. Excellent question. Because my personal opinion is spiritualism is not a religion.
Right.
It's a fact of life. The pure and simple
General
scientific
knowledge.
fact of life. We make it a religion because inherent in the human form is a religious instinct, I think.
Right.
We all have a religion. It's like the spawning run of the salmon or the migration of birds. It's an instinct. We all have it. You could trace that right back to the beginning of civilization, where man had to worship something, had to believe in something greater than himself. So we all have that within us. There's three components to spiritualism. One is the philosophical component. There's a second, which is a scientific component. And the third, which is a religious component. We tend to center, I think, sometimes too much on the religious component as a practice. Because religion is based upon practices as much as, beliefs or anything else. In chronological form, it was a philosophy. Spiritualism, communication with spirit has always existed. You can go right back to the oracles of Greece. I mean, they were mediums. Joan of Arc was a medium. Socrates was a medium. I mean, you can go back and you can document communication with spirit since the beginning of time. But philosophically, there was no coherence to it. And it started to develop some sort of cohesiveness as a philosophy related to some sort of structured spiritual universe with a fellow by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a Swedish scientist, mathematician. He was a seer. And he lived, I think it was the mid-1600s to mid-1700s, somewhere in that time period. And he was the first in recorded documentation to define what we know as a spirit world. He was a seer. He went into, a trance condition, and he thought by providential design he was invited personally by God to visit the spiritual universe. And it's quite, it's quite astounding, his writing, because he did visit the spiritual universe. He did communicate with spirits there, and he related his interpretation of those discussions into documented writings. And the most significant of them was a series of 12 volumes called the Arcana Celestia, which he dissects the Christian Bible and relates it to what he saw or experienced in the spiritual universe. But it was, he thought he was appointed by divine providence. And as with any founder of any religion, they all think they've been appointed by divine providence. And that's their one common denominator. It was his way or the highway. This is what I saw. But he did bring to society some very important concepts. And most of them you can relate to spiritualism. It was the forerunner of spiritualism. And the most important one, beside the communication aspect, which he had nobody, not too many people could do. He was very special in that regard. But he brought us the law of correspondences, where everything in existence corresponds at a higher level, which is that evolving from a lower form of life to a higher form of life. Basic in concept, similar in concept, but just a higher form of life. The law of correspondence filters right through the whole evolutionary process. And then he brought us the law of influxes, the concept of influxes, where a divine force filters down from God through to all society. But he left it at that because it filtered down to humans. Then it took a fellow by the name of Andrew Jackson Davis to come along in the mid-1800s to put a different spin on it. He visited the spiritual universe through a series of 157 trans lectures that took place in the mid-18, 1845 to 1847, through that period of time. But he didn't claim to talk to people there. He just observed what he saw. He was impressed. And he gave, through these lectures, each lasting 3 to 4 hours in the trance condition, he dictated what he had seen. And he took Swedenborg one step further, because he connected everything in nature together. It was a relationship between Father God and Mother Nature. And he added the concept of the component of the soul continually evolving to higher levels. Everything in existence evolving to higher levels. Everything had a duality. We talked about this concept of reincarnation. There's a tie-in there. That everything had a material side and an inner spiritual side. And it was the inner spiritual side that continued to evolve. And everything, that has it, that has it, that has it. Animals have it. Some people say, well, we shouldn't eat animals. But if you take a look at Davis's philosophy, you're ingesting a spiritual component that enhances your own spirituality. So whether that's valid or not, you can make up your own mind on that. And he himself said that no revelation is infallible. And this is the beauty of this man. He says, this is what I saw. This is my impression. He says, if you don't like it, don't accept it. Make up your own. Use your own powers of reasoning to determine that which is the truth and that which is not the truth. A year later, let me back up a bit. In that book, in the last component of that book, he said, there will be a demonstration where spirit on the earth plane will communicate with spirit in the spiritual universe. A year later, Hydeville happened. And on that same night, he wrote in his diary that he heard a tender and strong voice say to him, brother, the good work has begun. A living demonstration is born. That exact same night, Hydeville happened. That's when the Fox sisters established intelligent communication with the spirit of Charles Rosin. So we had Jackson bringing us the philosophy. We had Hydeville bringing the science, the communication. And I would suggest that neither one of them could have stood on their own. That we wouldn't be sitting here together without those two components. If it was just Jet Davis, it would have been just another nice, good read. Well, it wasn't a good read, it's a very difficult read. And the communication would have been just another fad in the history of the thing. But you put the two together, and they took off. Took a third component, 23 years later, to bring a religious connotation, because in those early days it was a social activist movement, born out of that free thought. If you had a protest and want somebody to carry a sign, call a spiritualist. They'd be there, walking around with a sign. They were social activists. They championed, women's rights, temperance movement, child labor reform, educational reform, anti-slavery. They were out there, beating the drums. But in 1871, 23 years later, in a sitting in New York City, Emma Harding's Brighton. We all know Emma as one of the more prominent spiritualists of her day, trance-controlled speaker, who spent most of her career, a great deal of her career in America. She had a sitting one night in New York City. And interestingly enough, it was in the house of one of the Fox sisters that later in life got married. In the spirit of a prominent British social reformer from the 1600s came through, a fellow by the name of Robert Owen. Another interesting fact, his son was sitting in that circle that night. And he gave to spiritualism those 7 principles. That provided the focal point for spiritualism to evolve into a religious movement. That provided the religious component, something to believe in, something to hang your hat on, not just a philosophy, not just somebody talking to a dead person. It gave it some, satisfy It's often said that, the first requirement of any religion is that man must have something to believe in to give him any sense of mental peace, a sense of moral security. And that's religion. And that's what brought spiritualism together as a philosophy, a science, and a religion. And it's interestingly enough, it spread in the short space of 50 years. It was said that at least half the population of the United States believed in some form of spiritualism's activity, or practiced it. It was phenomenal. And then after that. That answer your question?
Yeah, just about, yeah.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if there is such a thing as reincarnation, does our free will go out the window? Do we get a choice whether we want to come back or not?
I don't know.
Right.
All the investigations I've done on it's mandated. I mean, it's just, you take a look through all those early civilizations we talked about. There was no choice in the matter. It was mandated. Some of them say, well, you had a choice of parents.
So our free will goes out the window?
Supposedly so, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that some people work through their own karma? Is it that they are very good manipulators?
Karma is as I mentioned, is a
Cause and effect.
law of cause and effect. You sow what you reap. You can't manipulate your way through that. It's a law. And if you believe in the law of karma, as Hindus do, then you have no choice in the matter.
It's very just.
It's a law. It's just like our natural law. The law of universal justice, or the law of cause and effect, the law of attraction, the law of reproduction. Those are laws that have been set in place by our Creator, to my understanding, that are totally unchangeable. Even He can't change it. If you use the term He, and I don't like using that, but the force that set in place those laws, He can't even change them. He's subject to them. Everybody's subject to them.
Sure.
So, therefore, where do you come up with the concept of retributive justice? I suggest you need to factor that into your equation when you're thinking about it.
What about your motive? I mean, say for instance, mercy killing, humour killing as well. Would that sort of cancel out that karmic?
I don't know. Well,
If you're doing something because you believe it's a kindness to someone.
Well, I can't answer that question. When you talk about motive, it reminds me of Silver Birch, because he in one of the Hannah Swafer circles, they talked about killing in the war, because he evolved during the wartime, and he said it evolved around motive. What was your motive? To help better the world, or prevent more harm to the world or to your fellow man? Very difficult question. It all boils down to anything in life. What's your motive for doing it? What's your motive for being involved with spiritualism? Is it purely an emotional attachment? Or is it a desire for knowledge? Is it for the buzz of communication with spirit? All important. But, what's the real motive is, to my mind, if anything we learn in spiritualism has to be useful. And I've spent the afternoon with Joan listening to a tape where the ex-president of this church, Ivor Davis, was relating, what mediumship is for. If you can't use it to be useful, what purpose is it? Or anything else of that matter. If you can't use it to be useful, and that's spiritualism's philosophy. That's where Davis comes in. He says everything has to use. Everything has to be practical. Everything has to be useful. If there's no use to it, what's the point of it? So think about that. What's the purpose of communion with Spirit? What's the use of that? Beyond self-gratification. Now, I recognize you just had an impact upon your lives. And that's useful because it gives you comfort. And that's a useful purpose. And that's one of the components of mediumship, is to provide that comfort and that assurance that everything's well. It's okay. I'm happy. We're moving on. And we'll always be with you. All you have to do is think of us. We're there. But they've got their own path of progress as well. Not always around. That comes to the question, where's the spirit world? I mean, you can carry this on and on and on and get into some really interesting debate. Where's the spirit world? It's as close as you want it to be.
Could I just ask one? The Atlanteans were super calm. They were supermen.
The who?
The Atlanteans.
Atlanteans, yes?
Yes. How come that, I want to ask you, did they believe in reincarnation? Because they were so perfect, they didn't need it.
Well, there's a school of thought that they did believe in reincarnation, but...
They did?
Yeah, but who knows? They're outside of recorded history, really.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows, yeah. It's all,
submerged.
thinking and supposition. And that's where, spiritualism comes into play again. It goes beyond supposition. Use those powers to come to a logical conclusion. I sometimes get myself in trouble because I look at spiritualism as an intellectual thing rather than an emotional thing. It can be emotional, it should be emotional, but only on the realization of your intellectual conclusion. Once you come to that, there's a pathway of progress. There is that. Going back to philosophy, let me interject another component. The object of the soul. What's the soul's ultimate destiny? What's he searching for? He's searching for knowledge, turn it into wisdom, and use that to turn it into a love that can help other souls, both on this earth plane and collectively in the societies in which they live. But in reality, that leads to only one thing. The soul, in our philosophical context, the soul's objective, his search, is for nothing other than happiness. Personal happiness. And in that context, if you can help your fellow man, you become happier. Because who of us hasn't felt better after a smile or helping somebody? It's happiness. It's joy. And that's when spirit comes back. They come back with pure joy because they can be of some service. So my suggestion would be use them to be of service to your own personal growth. Not just to talk to Aunt Nell. Or try to figure out a communication that, a medium is giving you a message and you're saying, I gotta make this fit somehow. I gotta make this fit somehow. Don't we all do it? Right? Think about it. Don't we all do it? I gotta make this fit somehow. Can't disappoint the medium. Test them. Use it because there's information coming through to make your own life more useful. To lead to your own personal happiness. That's what it's all about. God, I was a miserable son of a gun when I was younger. The older I get, I don't have enough time left. I'm starting to get happier.
Have we all done with questions? Yeah? So it just remains for me to thank you most warmly out. As always, your research is absolutely superb and you teach so much of what you have found in spiritualism and what we can find in spiritualism, and it makes a wonderful evening, doesn't it? So I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I must recommend to you, I've been reading Al's book today, Love and Progress. I hope it's not out of print.
No, you can get the psychic bookstore or the psychic news. Yeah.
Try and get a copy. because it's a series of lectures that Al has given previously, and there is so much in that I think you read and you think, yes, that's why I came into spiritualism, that's what it's about. And that's what Al has done, shared with us, and through his search for knowledge, he's spread that truth and that happiness to many, many people. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you for those kind words. My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure.